I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. So this evening I'm going to start with some autumn poetry. It's definitely turning into that time of year. And then I am going to finish with one or two essays by Joseph Addison. So let's start with the poetry. The first is called Autumn, and it's by John Keats. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and pump the hazel shelves with a sweet kernel to set the budding more, and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy shells. Who has not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. And sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cedar press, with patient look thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Ay, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn, among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. Next, To Autumn by William Blake. O autumn, laden with fruit, and stained with the blood of the grape, pass not, but sit beneath thy shady roof. There thou mayst rest, and tune thy jolly voice to my fresh pipe, and all the daughters of the year shall dance. Sing now the lusty song of fruits and flowers. The narrow bud opens her beauties to the sun, and love runs in her thrilling veins. Blossoms hang round the brows of morning, and flourish down the bright cheek of modest eve, till clustering summer breaks forth into singing, and feathered clouds strew flowers round her head. The spirits of the air live on smells of fruit, and joy with pinions light roves round the gardens, or sits singing in the trees. Thus sang the jolly autumn as he sat, then rose, girded himself, and o'er the bleak hills fled from our sight, but left his golden load. And finally, our last poem of this evening is called Merry Autumn by Laurence Dunbar. It's all a farce, these tales they tell, about the breezes sighing, and moons astir o'er field and dell, because the year is dying. Such principles are most absurd. I care not who first taught 'em. There's nothing known to beast or bird to make a solemn autumn. In solemn times, when grief holds sway with countenance distressing, you'll note the more of black and gray will then be used in dressing. Now purple tints are all around. The sky is blue and mellow, and e'en the grasses turn the ground from modest green to yellow. The seed burrs all with laughter crack on featherweed and jimson, and leaves that should be dressed in black are all decked out in crimson. A butterfly goes winging by, a singing bird comes after, and nature all from earth to sky is bubbling o'er with laughter. The ripples wimple on the rills like sparkling little lasses. The sunlight runs along the hills and laughs among the grasses. The earth is just so full of fun, it really can't contain it. And streams of mirth so freely run, the heavens seem to rain it. Don't talk to me of solemn days and autumn's time of splendor, because the sun shows fewer rays and these grow slant and slender. Why, it's the climax of the year, the highest time of living, till naturally its bursting cheer just melts into Thanksgiving. So there's our little touch of autumn poetry. And now I am going to read an essay called Spare Time. It's by Joseph Addison. Joseph Addison was an English essayist. He was born in 1672, and with his longtime friend Richard Steele, he founded The Spectator, which was a popular magazine of the time, and it popularized the familiar essay. So the essay I'm reading, as I mentioned before, is called Spare Time. We all of us complain of the shortness of time, saith Seneca, and yet have much more than we know what to do with. Our lives, says he, are spent either in doing nothing at all, or in doing nothing to the purpose, or in doing nothing that we ought to do. We are always complaining that our days are few, and acting as though there would be no end of them. That noble philosopher described our inconsistency with ourselves, in this particular, by all those various turns of expression and thoughts which are peculiar to his writings. I often consider mankind as wholly inconsistent with itself in a point that bears some affinity to the former. Though we seem grieved at the shortness of life in general, we are wishing every period of it at an end. The miner longs to be of age, then to be a man of business, then to make up an estate, then to arrive at honors, then to retire. Thus, although the whole of life is allowed by everyone to be short, the several divisions of it appear long and tedious. We are for lengthening our span in general, but would fain contract the parts of it of which it is composed. The usurer would be very well satisfied to have all the time annihilated that lies between the present moment and the next quarter day. The politician would be contented to lose 3 years in his life, could he place things in the posture which he fancies they will stand in after such a revolution of time. The lover would be glad to strike out of his existence all the moments that are to pass away before the happy meeting. Thus, as fast as our time runs, we should be very glad in most part of our lives that it ran much faster than it does. Several hours of the day hang upon our hands. Nay, we wish away whole years, and travel through time as through a country filled with many wild and empty wastes, which we would fain hurry over, that we may arrive at those several little settlements or imaginary points of rest which are dispersed up and down in it. If we divide the life of most men into 20 parts, we shall find that at least 19 of them are mere gaps and chasms, which are neither filled with pleasure nor business. I do not, however, include in this calculation the life of those men who are in a perpetual hurry of affairs, but of those only who are not always engaged in scenes of action. And I hope I shall not do an unacceptable piece of service to these persons, if I point out to them certain methods for filling up their empty spaces of life. The methods I propose to them are as follows. The first is the exercise of virtue, in the most general acceptation of the word. That particular scheme which comprehends the social virtues may give employment to the most industrious temper, and find a man in business more than the most active station of life. To advise the ignorant, relieve the needy, comfort the afflicted, are duties that fall in our way almost every day of our lives. A man has frequent opportunities of mitigating the fierceness of a party, of doing justice to the character of a deserving man, of softening the envious, quieting the angry, and rectifying the prejudiced, which all of them employments suited to a reasonable nature, and bring great satisfaction to the person who can busy himself in them with discretion. There's another kind of virtue that may find employment for those retired hours in which we are altogether left to ourselves and destitute of company and conversation. I mean that intercourse and communication which every reasonable creature ought to maintain with the great author of his being. The man who lives under a habitual sense of the divine presence keeps up a perpetual cheerfulness of temper, and enjoys every moment the satisfaction of thinking himself in company with his dearest and best of friends. The time never lies heavy upon him. It is impossible for him to be alone. His thoughts and passions are the most busied at such hours when those of other men are the most inactive. He no sooner steps out of the world, but his heart burns with devotion, swells with hope, and triumphs in the consciousness of that presence which everywhere surrounds him, or, on the contrary, pours out its fears, its sorrows, its apprehensions to the great supporter of its existence. I have here only considered the necessity of a man's being virtuous, that he may have something to do. But if we consider further that the exercise of virtue is not only an amusement for the time it lasts, but that its influence extends to those parts of our existence which lie beyond the grave, and that our whole eternity is to take its color from those hours which we here employ in virtue or in vice, the argument redoubles upon us for putting in practice this method of passing away our time. When a man has but a little stock to improve, and has opportunities of turning it all to good account, what shall we think of him if he suffers 19 parts of it to lie dead, and perhaps employs even the 20th to his ruin or disadvantage? But because the mind cannot always be in its fervors, nor strained up to a pitch of virtue, it is necessary to find out proper employment for it in its relaxations. The next method, therefore, that I would propose to fill up our time should be useful and innocent diversions. I must confess, I think it is below reasonable creatures to be altogether conversant in such diversions as are merely innocent, and have nothing else to recommend them but that there is no hurt in them. Whether any kind of gaming has even thus much to say for itself, I shall not determine. But I think it is very wonderful to see persons of the best sense passing away a dozen hours together in shuffling and dividing a pack of cards, with no other conversation but what is made up of a few game phrases, and no other ideas but those of black or red dots ranged together in different figures. Would not a man laugh to hear any one of his species complaining that life is short? The stage might be made a perpetual source of the most noble and useful entertainments, were it under proper regulations. But the mind never unbends itself so agreeably as in the conversation of a well-chosen friend. There is indeed no blessing of life that is in any way comparable to the enjoyment of a discreet and virtuous friend. It eases and unloads the mind, clears and improves the understanding, engenders thoughts and knowledge, animates virtue and good resolutions, soothes and allays the passions, and finds employment for the most of the vacant hours of life. Next to such an intimacy with a particular person, one would endeavor, after a more general conversation, with such as are able to entertain and improve those with whom they converse, which are qualifications that seldom go asunder. There are many other useful amusements of life, which one would endeavor to multiply, that one might on all occasions have recourse to something rather than suffer the mind to lie idle, or run adrift with any passion that chances to rise in it. A man that has a taste of music, painting, or architecture is like one that has another sense, when compared with such as have no relish of those arts. The florist, the painter, the gardener, the husbandman, when they are only as accompaniments to the man of fortune, are great reliefs to a country life, and many ways useful to those, who are possessed of them. But of all the diversions of life, there is none so proper to fill up its empty spaces as the reading of useful and entertaining authors. But this I shall only touch upon, because it is in some measure interferes with the third method, which I shall propose in another paper, for the employment of our dead, inactive hours, and which I shall only mention in general to be the pursuit of knowledge. Part 2. The last method which I proposed in my Saturday's paper for filling up those empty spaces of life which are so tedious and burdensome to idle people is the employing ourselves in the pursuit of knowledge. I remember Mr. Boyle, speaking of a certain mineral, tells us that a man may consume his whole life in the study of it without arriving at the knowledge of all its qualities. The truth of it is, there is not a single science or any branch of it that might not furnish a man with business for life, though it were much longer than it is. I shall not here engage on those beaten subjects of the usefulness of knowledge, nor of the pleasure and perfection it gives the mind, nor on the methods of attaining it, nor recommend any particular branch of it, all which have been topics of many other writers, but shall indulge myself in a speculation that is more uncommon, and may therefore, perhaps, be more entertaining. I have before shown how the unemployed parts of life appear long and tedious, and shall here endeavor to show how those parts of life which are exercised in study, reading, and the pursuits of knowledge are long, but not tedious, and by that means discover a method of lengthening our lives, and at the same time of turning all the parts of them to our advantage. Mr. Locke observes that we get the idea of time or duration by reflecting on that train of ideas which succeed each other in our minds, that, for this reason, when we sleep soundly without dreaming, we have no perception of time, or the length of it whilst we sleep, and that the moment wherein we leave off to think, till the moment we begin to think again, seems to have no distance. To which the author adds, and so I doubt not but it would be to a waking man, if it were possible for him to keep only one idea in his mind, without variation in the succession of others, and we see that one who fixes his thoughts very intently on one thing, so as to take but little notice of the succession of ideas that pass in his mind whilst he is taken up with that earnest contemplation, lets slip out of his account a good part of that duration, and thinks that time is shorter than it is. We might carry this thought further, and consider a man as on one side shortening his time by thinking on nothing, or but on a few things, so on the other as lengthening it by employing his thoughts on many subjects, or by entertaining a quick and constant succession of ideas. Accordingly, Monsieur Malebranche, in his Inquiry After Truth, which was published several years before Mr. Locke's essay on human understanding, tells us that it is possible some creatures may think half an hour as long as we do 1,000 years, or look upon that space of duration which we call a minute as an hour, a week, a month, or a whole age. This notion of Mr. Malebranche is capable of some little explanation from what I have quoted out of Mr. Locke. For if our notion of time is produced by our reflecting on the succession of ideas in our mind, and this succession may be infinitely accelerated or retarded, it will follow that different beings have different notions of the same parts of duration, according to their ideas, which we suppose are equally distinct in each of them, follow one another in a greater or less degree of rapidity. There is a famous passage in the Alcoran, which looks as if Muhammad had been possessed of the notion which we are now speaking of. It is there said that the angel Gabriel took Muhammad out of his bed one morning to give him a sight of all things in the 7 heavens, in paradise and in hell, which the prophet took a distinct view of, and, after having held 90,000 conferences with God, was brought back again to his bed. All this, says the Alcoran, was transacted in so small a space of time that Mahomet, at his return, found his bed still warm, and took up an earthen pitcher, which was thrown down at the very instant that the angel Gabriel carried him away, before the water was all spilt. There is a very pretty story in the Turkish tales which relates to this passage of that famous impostor, and bears some affinity to the subject we are now upon. A sultan of Egypt, who was an infidel, used to laugh at this circumstance and at Mahomet's life, as what was altogether impossible and absurd. But conversing one day with a great doctor in the law, who had the gift of working miracles, the doctor told him he would quickly convince him of the truth of this passage in the history of Mahomet, if he would consent to do what he should desire of him. Upon this, the Sultan was directed to place himself by a huge tub of water, which he did accordingly. And as he stood by the tub amidst a circle of his great men, the holy man bade him plunge his head into the water and draw it up again. The king accordingly thrust his head into the water, and at the same time found himself at the foot of a mountain on a seashore. The king immediately began to rage against his doctor for this piece of treachery and witchcraft. But at length, knowing it was vain to be angry, he set himself to think on proper methods for getting a livelihood in this strange country. Accordingly, he applied himself to some people whom he saw at work in a neighboring wood. These people conducted him to a town that stood at a little distance from the wood, where, after some adventures, he married a woman of great beauty and fortune. He lived with this woman so long that he had by her 7 sons and 7 daughters. He was afterwards reduced to a great want, and forced to think of plying the streets as a porter for his livelihood. One day, as he was walking alone by the seaside, being seized with many melancholy reflections upon his former and his present state of life, which had raised a fit of devotion in him, he threw off his clothes with a design to wash himself, according to the custom of the Mohammedans, before he said his prayers. After his first plunge into the sea, he no sooner raised his head above the water, but he found himself standing by the side of the tub, with the great men of his court about him, and the holy man at his side. He immediately upbraided his teacher for having sent him on such a course of adventures, and betrayed him into so long a state of misery and servitude, but was wonderfully surprised when he heard that the state he talked of was only a dream and delusion, that he had not stirred from the place where he then stood, and that he had only dipped his head into the water and immediately taken it out again. The Mohammedan doctor took this occasion of instructing the Sultan that nothing was impossible with God, and that he, with whom 1,000 years are but as one day, can, if he pleases, make a single day, nay, a single moment, appear to any of his creatures as 1,000 years. I shall leave my reader to compare these Eastern fables with the notions of those 2 great philosophers whom I have quoted in this paper, and shall only, by way of application, desire him to consider how we may extend life beyond its natural dimensions, by applying ourselves diligently to the pursuit of knowledge. The hours of a wise man are lengthened by his ideas, as those of a fool are by his passions. The time of the one is long, because it does not know what to do with it. So is that of the other, because he distinguishes every moment of it with useful or amusing thoughts. Or, in other words, because the one is always wishing it away, and the other always enjoying it. How different is the view of past life, in the man who has grown old in knowledge and wisdom, from that of him who has grown old in ignorance and folly. The latter is like the owner of a barren country, that fills his eye with the prospect of naked hills and plains, which produce nothing either profitable or ornamental. The other beholds a beautiful and spacious landscape, divided into delightful gardens, green meadows, fruitful fields, and can scarce cast his eye on a single spot of his possessions that is not covered with some beautiful plant or flower. The end. Thank you very much for listening this evening, and I hope you have a wonderful week.